Tonight, we have a special treat for you. We searched deep in our vault and uncovered a piece of tape that we think you'll really enjoy. The program is from an author series that was produced at the Cambridge Public Library back in 1995 and features a Harvard Law School student reading from a memoir that he wrote titled Dreams from My Father, a story of race and inheritance. This particular law school student distinguished himself as the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review, and then some years later as the first African-American president of the United States. Sit back and enjoy a special archival presentation with Barrack Obama.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I noticed today as I was in the hotel room getting ready that Colin Powell is also here today. We were going to coordinate our tours, and he was a little worried that I'd siphon off the crowds, but it looks like he did okay. I'm very happy to be here today, although I admit that when I am in libraries in Cambridge, I get exam flashbacks. I start breaking out into cold sweats. But this is, in fact, the first time that I've been to the Cambridge Public Library, which shows you the kind of life we lead over at the law school. We don't leave campus too much. A little bit about myself and the book, a little preface. As was said in the introduction, my father was a black African, and my mother was a white American. And much of my life was spent trying to reconcile the terms of my birth, that divided heritage, with the realities of race and nationality, tribal identities that exist not just in this country but also overseas. So that this book is not so much a memoir, I think, as sort of a journey of discovery for me, some sense of trying to make sense of my family. And family is always a complicated thing, but it was a little bit more complicated for me. And part of that process of me understanding my family ends up understanding the larger forces that shaped my family. The first section of the book in particular talks about my grandparents and my mother's family, who grew up in such metropolises as Peru, Kansas, and El Dorado, Kansas. We're not sophisticates, we're not even liberal. We're about as mid-American as you could get. Really, if you look at pictures of my grandparents, and there's a picture on the cover of the book, and particularly in their older years, they look like they walked straight out of American Gothic. On the other side, my father's tribe, my father's family, came from a small Kenyan village on the shores of Lake Victoria. And sometimes we forget in some of the racial conflict that takes place in this country that contact between the West and Africa, and the West in Kenya and my father's village in particular, was relatively recent, so that my grandfather on my father's side was the first, or one of the first, Africans, black men, to ever see and meet and have direct contact with a white person. And this happened as recently as 1895. So that you have these widely divergent cultures coming together. And as a child, a lot of the conflicts that potentially arise out of that were tamped down in my life because they met in Hawaii. And they met at a time that was full of idealism. It was during the Civil Rights Movement. Hawaii, as it is, had almost a mythic reputation of being multicultural. And so that my parents were swept up in the idealism of that time and the hopefulness of that time, the sense that you might be able to create in this country a nation that was built on a sense of community and equity and fairness. And as we know, many of those dreams of my parents ended up fraying as time went on. Their marriage broke apart, but also I think the hopes and dreams of the nation began to crumble in the later 60s. And so I end up coming into adolescence at a time when the tensions between the races, even in a place like Hawaii, are becoming more pronounced. And sort of the identity politics that is so pronounced today was already starting to come to the fore. So the section that I'm going to read for you right now takes place during my adolescence. And I'm a very angry man, young man, at the time that this passage takes place. Partly because my father is absent, partly because I'm trying to struggle, what does it mean exactly to be a black man in America? Partly because I'm sufficiently isolated in Hawaii without a large African-American community, without father figures around that might guide me and steer my anger. What I end up relying on are the images and stereotypes that are coming through the media. And I'm having to patch together and piece together exactly what it means for me to be both African and an American. So the passage that I'm going to read right now takes place right after a party. And what's happened is that typically when I went to parties in high school, oftentimes there were 3 or 4 black people in a room of 300. So finally, a black friend of mine and myself decided to invite some white friends to a black party out in an army base, out in Schofield Barracks, one of the major army bases in Hawaii. And we immediately sensed that they're a little uncomfortable being in this minority situation. You know, they're sort of trying to tap their foot to the beat. You know, they're being extraordinarily friendly. And after a while, they decide, after about half an hour, they say, well, Barrack, let's get going. You know, we're feeling kind of tired, we're feeling this or that. And suddenly, this sense that what I have had to put up with every day of my life is something that they find so objectionable that they can't even put up with it for a day. And these are good friends of mine and folks who had stood by me for many years. Something is triggered in my head, and I suddenly start seeing, as I say in this passage, a new map of the world. A couple of other notes of explanation. As I work through this anger, this sense of betrayal, I discovered that I'm feeling that same sense of betrayal from my family. It all starts coming together. And some of the characters in the book, there will be Gramps, in this passage rather. Gramps is my grandfather. Toot is my grandmother. That's short for Tutu, which in Hawaii means grandmother. At the time when I was born, she decided she was too young to be called Granny, or Grams, so we called her Toot. And the passage finally ends with me having a conversation with a close friend of my maternal grandfather, a close friend of Gramps, a black man from Kansas named Frank, actually at the time a fairly well-known poet named Frank Marshall Davis, who had moved to Hawaii and lived there. And so I have a discussion with him about the kinds of frustrations I'm having, and he sort of schools me on that I should get used to these frustrations. So let me dig in. We started down the road towards town, and in the silence, my mind began to rework Ray's words that day with Kurt. All the discussions we'd had before that, the events of that night. And by the time I had dropped my friends off, I had begun to see a new map of the world, one that was frightening in its simplicity, suffocating in its implications. We were always playing on the white man's court, Ray had told me, by the white man's rules. If the principal, or the coach, or a teacher, or Kurt wanted to spit in your face, he could, because he had power and you did not. If he decided not to, if he treated you like a man or came to your defense, it was because he knew that the words you spoke, the clothes you wore, the books that you read, your ambitions and desires were already his. Whatever he decided to do, it was his decision to make, not yours, and because of that fundamental power he held over you, because it preceded and would outlast his individual motives and inclinations, any distinction between good and bad whites held negligible meaning. In fact, you couldn't even be sure that everything you had assumed to be an expression of your black unfettered self, the humor, the song, the behind-the-back pass, had been freely chosen by you. At best, these things were a refuge. At worst, a trap. Following this maddening logic, the only thing you could choose as your own was withdrawal into a smaller and smaller coil of rage, until being black meant only the knowledge of your own powerlessness and your own defeat. And the final irony, should you refuse this defeat and lash out at your captors, they would have a name for that too, a name that could cage you just as good, like paranoid, or militant, or violent, or nigger. Over the next few months, I looked to corroborate this nightmare vision of mine. I gathered up books from the library, Baldwin, Ellison, Hughes, Wright, Dubois. At night, I would close the door to my room, telling my grandparents I had homework to do, and there I would sit and wrestle with words, locked in suddenly desperate argument, trying to reconcile the world as I had found it with the terms of my birth. But there seemed to be no escape to be had. In every page of every book, in Bigger Thomas and Invisible Men, I kept finding the same anguish, the same doubt, a self-contempt that neither irony nor intellect seemed able to deflect. Even Dubois' learning and Baldwin's love and Langston's humor eventually succumbed to its corrosive force, each man finally forced to doubt art's redemptive power, each man finally forced to withdraw, one to Africa, one to Europe, one deeper into the bowels of Harlem, but all of them in the same weary flight, all of them exhausted, bitter men, the devil at their heels. Only Malcolm X's autobiography seemed to offer something different. His repeated acts of self-creation spoke to me. The blunt poetry of his words, his insistence on respect, promised a new and uncompromising order, martial in its discipline, forged through sheer force of will. All the other stuff, the talk of blue-eyed devils and apocalypse, was incidental to that program, I decided. Religious baggage that Malcolm himself seemed to have safely abandoned towards the end of his life. And yet, even as I imagined myself following Malcolm's call, one line in the book stayed with me. For he spoke of a wish he'd once had, the wish that the white blood that ran through him there by an act of violence might somehow be expunged. I knew that for Malcolm, that wish would never be incidental. I knew as well that traveling down the road to self-respect, my own white blood would never recede into mere abstraction. So I was left to wonder what else I would be severing if and when I left my mother and my grandparents at some uncharted border. And two, if Malcolm's discovery towards the end of his life that some